On today's Hiwatt Soundbite, we're engineering and recording a professional multitrack. Well, am I ever excited about today's session? Totally inspired by 3 of the last 4 multitracks that I've received from clients to do productions and mixes on. Oh man, there is a major trend going on in this business that I see as a huge red flag and something that I feel responsible to address. What am I talking about? Recording levels. Now, I'm not kidding. 3 of the last 4 multitracks that I've opened up in my own system to start a mix on, there are audio tracks within that session that aren't even registering a waveform. In other words, the recording levels of those tracks that have been recorded on that multitrack are so low that many of them aren't even registering a waveform. I'm talking like -40, -50, okay? I believe I have a very strong theory as to why this is happening. There has been an incredibly cool feature introduced to the modern DAW over the last 10 years called commit. In Pro Tools, it's called commit. In your DAW, it might be called something else. It's an incredibly cool function that allows me to select all of my instrument tracks, for instance, my virtual instruments, and with one click, create audio files of all those tracks. Well, this is an incredibly handy function, but this is not how you make a multitrack. Absolutely no way, shape, or form. That commit button should be thought of as a placeholder. You know, if I have a guitar overdub that I need to do with a colleague that's maybe down the street or in the next city, this commit button is perfect. The results of using that commit function are a set of tracks that make all kinds of sense for a temporary use. In other words, I can send all of those files over to my guitar player. Well, then they could just do their guitar overdubs and for the most part, just send me the 2 guitar parts back. The rest of that multitrack was placeholder. That thing gets tossed in the trash can. I believe there's a misconception going on that people believe that because they have 144 dB of dynamic range in a modern DAW at 24-bit, they no longer have to worry about their recording levels. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Doesn't mean I'm pushing my digital levels. I'm not talking about doing that at all. I'm just talking about let's record at a reasonable level. Let's make sure that when an outside engineer opens up our session, that they can actually see a waveform inside that audio file, okay? This is important. So for today's session, I threw together a little jam that will be a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. I think we should take the time to go ahead and use that commit function inside my Pro Tools session so that we can actually see what the results are, exactly what goes down. And then ultimately, I want to take you through a step-by-step process of how I like to create my multitracks. And I promise you, I'm not using the commit button. When I send my multitrack out to an outside producer, I want them to open up that session and be sort of blown away at how well organized it is and how well tracked it is. So just for perspective, let's have a listen to this little ditty I did. It's just over a minute long. Check it. Definitely in its early stages, but it'll provide a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. The first thing I'm going to do in this session, I'm going to go through and select all of my virtual synths that are making sounds. Now I can simply go up to my track menu and I can hit the commit button. It's going to open up a separate window. And inside this window, I have a bunch of options of what's going to happen in this process. The default inside of Pro Tools is once that commit function has happened, those source tracks become inactive. In this particular case, I'm going to select do nothing because I want to go back and actually get into how I typically record a multi-track afterwards. I want access to all those tracks. Let's check it. So boom, Pro Tools just magically converted all of those virtual synth tracks and MIDI parts into a bunch of audio files for me. But have a look at these audio files. The results are some of those tracks just being way too hot and some of them being way too low, with a few of them being kind of right in the right range. Let's go ahead and make those tracks inactive so that we can still hear the virtual stuff. Now it's time to bust in and record a professional multi-track. You know, let's forget about that commit button and let's consider every one of these parts. Now, call me old school, but I got in this business over 35 years ago, and I learned how to be a recording engineer, somebody who considers every single sound that I record. This commit button, this is like anti-recording engineer button. That's absolutely against everything that I've learned for the last 35 years. That commit button is incredibly handy for a placeholder session, but that is all that you should be looking at that commit button for. Dust that idea. When it comes to making a multi-track, I want to encourage you to record every single track individually in real time. For today's session, I'm going to be running everything through my analog chain, which is very typical of what I get up to. If you don't have an analog solution like I've got with my APIs, no problem. Just set up an auxiliary bus inside of your DAW that you can just route each one of these individual parts to and track them. You can offer a little bit of mild compression, maybe a little bit of EQ for each one of those overdub sounds. It's going to add up to a much better sounding recording, and every time a way more professionally recorded master. Okay, so first things first, let's patch the analog output of my Apollo 5 and 6 into the line input of my API. The very first thing I'm going to do is go up to this first track, Scratchy. I'm going to assign it to output 5 and 6. And boom, I see it shows up at my API. For me, I just make a brand new audio track directly below the one I'm tracking. In this case, this track is called Scratchy. I'll just copy that name and I'll go to my next track and I'll just put a T at the end of it so that I know that it's tracked. Okay, so it's Scratchy with a T on it. I'm going to assign its input so that it comes in from the API. If I go to input, now personally, when I go to overdub individual tracks like I'm doing one at a time right now, every time I'm going to introduce a little bit of compression. Not talking about a lot. I'm maybe 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio. I'm just going to be very, very mild with that compression. A slow attack and a fast release generally. Almost always, that compressor will be the first thing in my chain. Typically, if I throw a little EQ on it, I'll put that EQ after that compressor. Unless I'm going for a very specific effect, that's typically my kind of routing chain. You know, compression, EQ. You know, in most cases, I'm not looking to go in and totally enhance every single one of these tracks that's going down. I just want to tweak it a little bit. And I absolutely want to make sure that I'm recording at a reasonable level. So pretty simple, right? Just functioning as a recording engineer. I'm just tweaking a little bit of that sound before I record it. I'm not just hitting a commit button. I'm considering that sound. I'm listening to it. I'm using my ears. Let's record this. Lovely. That's the only time that specific sound happens just like that. So I can literally take this track, Scratchy, that I just finished tracking, go inactive, right? I just make it inactive. Take this out of record. I did increase the level going down to this track. So I'm going to have to rebalance the output of that track. When I set those playback levels, I'll just be using my ears and kind of resetting that level. All right, so we got our first track recorded. Let's go to the next piece. Totally filtered version of that intro sound, right? Same thing, I'm going to go up and make a brand new stereo track. I'm going to take the name filter and copy it, go to my next track, paste it, and put a big T at the end of it. So I know that this is filtered tracked. Very next thing is I'm going to assign the output to 5 and 6 to get it going to that API chain. And then that filter comes back and I set the input for 1 and 2. And once again, I'm using my ears, right? Just because I have the chain in place doesn't necessarily mean I need equalization. In this particular sound, I've turned the EQ off and I'm just using a bit more compression on it than I was on the last overdub sound. The true benefit of engineering your overdub tracks the way I'm doing right now doesn't really show until you start adding all of those tracks together. It makes a major, major difference in how that track comes across to that mix engineer. When they put those tracks up, if you've gone through and paid attention to those sounds and you've done everything that you can to that sound to kind of beef it up and make it pop, that mix engineer is just going to be so much more blown away. And the options that they have, they're not going to have to go mess with your session. They're not going to have to take a bunch of time figuring out how to fix stuff. They can just dive right in and get creative working with your awesome tracks. So let's get this next one recorded. And I've got this sound happening again at the end of this track, so let's record that one. Okay, so we tracked that filter sound. Now I can simply go up and make this track inactive. Very typically, I don't jump around and do any kind of weird order. I just start at the top of my multitrack and I just start working my way down. What I'm doing right now is tracking. I'm not mixing. I'm not considering even mixing. I'm not even concerned about what those playback levels are right now. All I'm doing is trying to do my best to track each one of these sounds to the best of my ability, to consider each one of them and to see what I can do to those tracks to help enhance them, to make them sparkle a bit more, to make them pop. This procedure is worth its weight in gold, and this is what being a recording engineer is all about. You're definitely not hitting a commit button. When you're making a professional multi-track that potentially is going to go out there and some other engineer is going to look at it and open it up and have a mix or something, yeah, you want to take consideration on those tracks. I'm a proud recording engineer. When someone opens up one of my tracks, I want them to be blown away. Now, for me in my analog chain, just always making sure I'm not hitting the API too hard, right? I want that thing to be heated up, but I certainly don't want to be clipping on it. So once again, I'm just usually using my ears, the best tool, the most accurate tool that I have in my whole studio right here. So I like it. I think I'm ready to track that. Got that tracked. We can simply make that track inactive, moving right along. Next track down is a power chord. Let's hear this. Let's send that through my API chain and assign the appropriate inputs, outputs. Very subtle what I'm doing here, but just tweaking, right? Tiny little tweaks. Here we go. Yeah, let's go up and record this animator track. Same old school, right? We just like assign this output to 5 and 6, assign the appropriate inputs and outputs, and we're there. We got this animator track running. Sounds great. Let's track that. We've got this next piece. Well, that sequence is from my Euro rack, so it's already in an audio file format, right? But when I'm building a multi-track like I'm doing today, I consider every single one of these tracks, including the ones that are actual audio tracks. So instead of just passing this Euro rack track along with this session, I'm going to consider it. I'm going to run that Euro rack back through my analog chain and see what I can do with that sound. All right, I like it. So let's track that. So this Euro sequence is a good example of a track that I didn't add any EQ or compression through that chain. Just ran it through the analog chain and got a more appropriate level set for that audio track. Next track is this cool little feedback thing going on. Let's have a look at this. Just a cool distortion track coming through. Let's create a destination track for that one. Put everything in record and kind of a strange artifact left in that thing with that weird thump, but might sound cool in the mix. We'll leave it there for now. Okay, I believe we've tracked all the virtual instruments in this session. What I'll typically do now is I'll go back and kind of double check and clean up this session at the same time. If I haven't already done it, I'll make sure that virtual synth or virtual track is in the inactive mode, right? As soon as I do that, I can very simply go and start hiding these tracks, right? Now, one thing I always do is make sure you mute that MIDI track before you hide it. This can create total havoc and confusion down the trail. If you hide a MIDI track that's not muted, oh yeah, it can create all kinds of havoc in your session later. I think some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So let's continue cleaning up my session, making sure that MIDI track is definitely muted. And I can just go through and continue to clean my session up. Okay, we've recorded all our virtual synths. Now, I've got some acoustic guitar parts at the beginning of this track that sort of set up an intro, including a regenerating delay thing. Well, if I'm sending this session out, there's no way that I'm going to include some automation, in plugins inside of that session. There's no way. I need to commit that track. If I've gone in and set up automation to have that feedback work exactly how I want it to work in this session, I want to take a few minutes right now and track those effects so that when I send this multi-track out, there's no messing around. No one has to have any plugins. They just literally pull up that session and they've got every single audio track with effects, right? So let's go ahead and track those. That tiny little bit of clipping we're hearing in that is inherent in that delay for sure. Well, boom, now we've got a professionally engineered and recorded multi-track session, one that we can package up and send anywhere in the world, and whoever opens that session on the other end isn't going to be confused, right? They're not going to be seeing audio files and wondering if there's even any audio content in those files. It's loud and clear that there's content in all of these files, and when they start listening to them individually, it's going to be apparent that somebody took their time and actually took the time to engineer each one of these tracks. Now notice that I was soloing up all of these sounds as I was laying them down. I wasn't trying to listen to those sounds in the perspective of the mix. Not really possible when you're running through an analog chain like I'm doing. As soon as I leave the digital domain and I go out to my analog world and come back, there's tons of latency introduced with that. So that's why you see me soloing sounds as I'm tracking them. Remember, my goal when tracking these sounds is absolutely not to try and come up with the final tone of that sound to work in the mix. I want to listen to that sound individually. I want to consider what it is that I could do to that sound to enhance it, to sort of just give it a little bit of extra sparkle. When you go through and consider each one of your overdubs like this and you put just a little bit of extra love and care into each one of those sounds, when you go to mix in the end, it makes such a big difference. So you start putting up these tracks to do a mix, and it makes a substantial difference. Well, thank you very much for sitting in on today's session, and I sincerely hope that this session inspires you to stop using that commit button when making multi-tracks. When you're preparing and recording a professional multi-track, I encourage you to consider each one of those sounds as a recording engineer, even if it's just 1% more. When you're talking about a great big project and tons of overdubs, the cumulative effect of all of those tiny, subtle little changes make a big picture difference to your mix. I think you're going to be blown away with the results.